In 1993, the United States military began construction on a research facility in the Alaskan wilderness, remote, isolated, far from population centers and prying eyes. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, HAARP. Officially, it studies the ionosphere, that layer of atmosphere where Earth meets space, radio propagation, communication systems, scientific research into atmospheric behavior. The facility consists of 180 antennas arranged in a grid, capable of beaming 3.6 billion watts of energy into the sky. More power than most radio stations use in a year, focused into a single beam aimed upward. They said it was for understanding the aurora borealis, improving GPS, advancing communication technology. But what if that's not the full story? A contractor who worked on the initial construction, he identified himself only as David, spoke to a radio host years after the facility became operational. He described what it was like building something when you weren't told what it was for. The antenna array went up systematically, each tower precisely positioned, cables running underground to massive power systems housed in reinforced buildings. "We knew it was military," David said. "The security, the compartmentalization, you didn't ask questions." But he remembered one conversation with an engineer who'd had a few drinks after a long shift. He told me it wasn't just about studying the atmosphere. He said they were going to bounce energy off the ionosphere, redirect it, focus it back down to specific locations on Earth. David asked what that meant. The engineer got quiet. Then he said, weather modification, communication disruption, maybe more. He didn't elaborate. The next day, he avoided David completely. According to a former Air Force technician who worked at HAARP during its early operational years, the official mission didn't match the actual experiments. The technician, who requested anonymity, described transmission schedules that didn't align with published research, late-night operations with restricted access, days when civilian scientists were asked to leave the facility entirely. We'd power up the array and aim it at specific coordinates, not random atmospheric study, precise targeting. He mentioned receiving instructions from outside the normal chain of command, protocols that bypassed the university partnerships officially running the research. One time we ran a sustained transmission for 18 hours straight, maximum power focused on a single point in the upper atmosphere. 3 days later, a massive storm system developed over the Pacific, unprecedented intensity. It stalled off the coast for nearly a week, flooding regions that rarely saw rain. He said, "I'm not saying we caused it. I'm saying the timing was notable." Dr. Bernard Eastlund was a physicist who held patents related to ionospheric heating technology. His work described using powerful radio waves to alter atmospheric patterns, disrupt communications, and potentially influence weather systems. HAARP's design closely resembles Eastlund's patents. When asked about the connection, Eastlund was careful. He acknowledged his work influenced the technology, but claimed HAARP's capabilities were significantly limited compared to what his patents described. Then he stopped talking about it altogether. Years later, in a rare interview, he said only, "There are applications of this technology that the public doesn't need to understand." He died before elaborating. The official narrative shifted over the years. Initially, HAARP was described as pure atmospheric research, studying the ionosphere to improve radio communication and GPS accuracy. The Department of Defense funded it, but through academic partnerships that made it seem benign. Then, the patents surfaced. Documents obtained through FOIA requests showed military interest in ionospheric manipulation dated back decades. Research into using radio frequency energy to modify atmospheric conditions to disrupt enemy communications. to create artificial auroras that could interfere with satellite systems. HARP's specifications matched those theoretical applications perfectly. When questioned, military officials emphasized the research angle, scientific discovery, understanding natural phenomena. But they also acknowledged dual-use potential, the euphemism for technology with both civilian and military applications. For those who remember when the government said DDT was safe, the pattern was familiar. Congressional testimony from the 90s includes references to atmospheric defense systems and strategic environmental capabilities, language that suggests HARP was more than just telescopes pointed at the sky. One memo discusses operational readiness and deployment scenarios, terms that don't typically apply to scientific instruments. Another references coordination with naval communications systems, submarine detection, over-the-horizon radar applications. The part they didn't put in press releases. Around the same time HARP became operational, weather patterns in the Pacific Northwest began showing unusual behavior. Storms intensifying rapidly, atmospheric rivers stalling in place, temperature anomalies that meteorologists struggled to explain using conventional models. Correlation isn't causation, but the timing raised questions. Then there were the earthquakes. Major seismic events sometimes coincided with reported HARP transmission schedules. Not always, not even usually, but enough times that researchers started tracking it. A significant quake in Alaska, another in the Pacific, tremors in regions not typically seismically active. Each time, conspiracy researchers claimed HARP had been operating at full power in the days before. Each time, officials denied any connection. Earthquakes are natural. HARP studies the ionosphere, not the ground. But documents revealed something interesting. The military had researched earthquake generation as a theoretical weapon decades earlier. Studies into using resonant frequencies to trigger seismic activity. None of it proven. All of it classified. HARP's funding told its own story. For years, the military poured resources into the facility. Then, suddenly, it was shut down. Budget cuts, they said. Mission accomplished. The facility was transferred to the University of Alaska, civilian control, open research. But the shutdown happened right as public scrutiny intensified, right as congressional inquiries began asking uncomfortable questions. And then, just a few years later, it was quietly reactivated. Different funding sources, new operational parameters, less public visibility. It's not that they stopped using HARP, it's that they stopped telling us they were using it.
The facility itself sits at 62.39 degrees north latitude, deep in the Alaskan interior. Remote enough that casual visitors can't just drive by. Accessible only through controlled routes with military checkpoints nearby. The antenna array is massive, 180 cross-dipole antennas spread across 33 acres. Each tower capable of transmitting independently or in coordination with the others. The combined power output is staggering. 3.6 billion watts focused into a narrow beam. That's not research equipment. That's a weapon-grade power level. Photographs of the facility show something that looks more like a radar installation than a university laboratory. Reinforced structures, underground power systems, security infrastructure that seems excessive for studying atmospheric phenomena. Early images from the construction phase show additional buildings that don't appear in later documentation. Structures that were built, then removed from public site maps. Facilities that officially don't exist. The transmission logs, the ones that were made public, show regular operations during daylight hours. scheduled research sessions, predictable patterns. But residents in nearby communities reported hearing the facility at night, a deep hum, a vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. One amateur radio operator recorded strange interference patterns during late-night hours, frequencies that shouldn't have been in use, signals that seemed to pulse in coordinated bursts. The recordings were posted online. They disappeared within weeks. The sky above HAARP does strange things during transmissions. Visible auroras appearing at unusual times, atmospheric glows that don't match natural patterns, light phenomena that locals say they'd never seen before the facility became operational. Some of it can be explained. HAARP is designed to excite the ionosphere, creating artificial auroras. That's the stated purpose. But witnesses describe lights that behaved differently. Geometric patterns, organized structures, movements that seemed controlled rather than random. Not proof, but enough to get under your skin. Weather monitoring stations in Alaska recorded unusual atmospheric pressure changes during high-power transmission periods, rapid fluctuations, localized disturbances that meteorologists noted but couldn't explain through conventional atmospheric dynamics. One climatologist who analyzed the data said the patterns were consistent with artificial heating of the upper atmosphere. He was careful to add that correlation doesn't imply causation, but when pressed, he admitted, if you wanted to modify weather, this is what the early stages would look like. The facility's power consumption is another anomaly. During operational periods, the electrical draw spikes massively, far beyond what published research would require. Where does that energy go? Officially, into the ionosphere, into scientific measurements and atmospheric studies. But the math doesn't fully add up. The amount of power, the duration of transmissions, and the lack of corresponding published research suggests operations beyond what they're willing to discuss. You can see it in the gaps, in what they don't explain, in the facilities that exist but aren't mentioned, in the power usage that exceeds the stated mission. Something else is happening in that Alaskan wilderness, and someone doesn't want us looking too closely.
The most rational explanation is communication and surveillance. HAARP's stated mission includes improving radio propagation and understanding how the ionosphere affects signals. For military purposes, this makes perfect sense. Submarine communication relies on extremely low-frequency waves that bounce off the ionosphere. Over-the-horizon radar depends on similar principles. If HAARP can modify the ionosphere temporarily, it could create communication channels when normal systems fail. It could disrupt enemy transmissions. It could serve as a strategic asset in electronic warfare. This theory explains the military funding, the security, the operational secrecy. It doesn't require weather control or earthquake generation, just advanced communication technology with defensive and offensive applications. For those who remember when spy satellites or conspiracy theories before becoming public knowledge, this explanation is plausible. But it doesn't explain everything. The power levels, the timing of atmospheric disturbances, the patents that explicitly describe weather modification capabilities, which leads to the second theory, environmental warfare. What if HAARP is exactly what the patents describe? A system capable of manipulating atmospheric conditions, not controlling weather in the Hollywood sense, not making hurricanes appear on command, but influencing patterns, steering systems, intensifying or weakening storms. The technology exists in theory. Radio frequency heating can alter atmospheric pressure. Changes in the ionosphere can affect jet stream behavior. Small modifications in the right place could cascade into larger effects. During the Cold War, both superpowers researched environmental manipulation as a strategic capability. The ability to create droughts, floods, or storms in enemy territory without leaving conventional evidence would be militarily invaluable. HARP specifications match what such a system would require: the power, the precision, the geographic location. Alaska sits beneath major atmospheric current patterns. If this is true, it explains the secrecy. Environmental warfare is banned by international treaty. Admitting HARP has such capabilities would violate agreements signed decades ago. It also explains the shutdown and restart. Public pressure forced them to appear to comply with treaties. Then, once attention faded, they resumed operations under different justifications. Not weather control as magic, weather influence as engineering. And the implications are staggering, because if you can modify weather, you can create famines, you can destroy agriculture, you can destabilize nations without firing a shot. Remember Project Popeye, the verified military program that seeded clouds over Vietnam to extend monsoon seasons and disrupt enemy supply lines? They admitted to it years later, only after classified documents surfaced. What if HARP is the next evolution of that thinking? But there's a third possibility that researchers mention only in private conversations. What if HARP isn't just aimed at the atmosphere? The patents reference particle beam weapons and directed energy applications, language that suggests uses beyond communication or weather. What if the ionosphere isn't the target, but the mirror, a reflective layer that can bounce focused energy back to Earth, to specific coordinates, with precision? That would explain the targeting protocols the anonymous technician described, the sustained high-power transmissions, the coordination with satellite systems. It would also explain why the facility exists at all. Because if you wanted to develop a weapon that could strike anywhere on Earth, without satellites, without missiles, without conventional detection, bouncing energy off the ionosphere would be one way to do it. The physics are theoretical, but possible. The power requirements are massive, but achievable. The strategic value would justify decades of secrecy. And if true, HARP isn't a research facility. It's a prototype for a weapon that uses the sky itself as an amplifier.
It's not about what HARP does during published research hours. It's about what happens during the hours that aren't published. The people who work there during its classified operational phases don't talk about it. David, the contractor, left Alaska and hasn't returned. The Air Force technician changed careers entirely. Scientists who consulted early on now redirect conversations when HARP comes up. When the facility was transferred to the University of Alaska, many assumed transparency would follow, that civilian control meant public access to data, but the transmission schedules remain opaque. High-power operations still occur with minimal advance notice. Research publications are sparse and vague. The military officially divested, except they didn't. Funding still flows through Defense Department channels. Personnel with security clearances still staff key positions. It's civilian in name. Operational control remains exactly where it always was. For those who remember when the CIA said they weren't conducting mind control experiments, the pattern is unmistakable. What's changed since HARP became operational? Weather has become more extreme. Storms intensify faster. Droughts persist longer. Patterns that climate scientists explain through warming trends and natural cycles. And they're probably right. Climate change is real, anthropogenic, measurable, But that doesn't mean it's the only factor. Because if you wanted to test weather modification capabilities, you do it during a period when unusual weather could be attributed to other causes. When anomalies blend into the noise of a changing climate, when questions about artificial influence get dismissed as conspiracy thinking. HAARP sits silent most of the time now, at least publicly. The antenna array still stands, the power systems remain functional, the facility operational, just quieter, less visible. But the sky above Alaska still does strange things. Locals still report phenomena they can't explain. Weather patterns still show anomalies that models struggle to predict. And somewhere in a secured facility, transmission logs record activities that the public never sees. It's not proof, it's pattern. It's implication. It's the gap between what they tell us and what the evidence suggests. 9 decades ago, government said they'd never weaponize aircraft. Then came bombers. 70 decades ago, they said orbital weapons were science fiction. Then came ICBMs. 40 decades ago, they said directed energy weapons were fantasy. Then came lasers, microwaves, and plasma technology. What if HAARP is the next step in that evolution? Not a facility for studying the sky, but a facility for using it.
In 2024, a metadata leak from a scientific database briefly exposed internal HAARP transmission logs. Before the breach was patched, researchers archived several months of data. The logs showed high-power operations during periods officially listed as maintenance downtime, sustained transmissions aimed at specific ionospheric coordinates, coordination timestamps that aligned with naval exercises and atmospheric disturbances over the Pacific. One entry noted successful penetration at planned altitude, followed by reference codes that don't appear in any public documentation. The archives were scrubbed from research servers within days. Researchers who downloaded the files found their academic credentials suspended. No explanation, just sudden revocation of access. A single thread appeared on a scientific forum analyzing the data before it vanished. The final post read, "If this is just atmospheric research, why does the targeting precision match ballistic missile accuracies?" The thread was deleted. The account closed. HAARP remains operational, civilian-controlled, they say. But someone still cares deeply about what information gets out and what stays buried in the Alaskan wilderness.